Okay, so welcome in true style. Sorry, this isn't the 7th Academy tonight. This is Tuesday, April 4th, and this is my 3D to 5D transitioning to 5D empath group. So actually, Chris, I've worked with everybody here and cleared everybody here except for Kathy. But the usual format is this group was set up, one, to talk about the transition to 5D, but also for my empath clients to meet each other and allow that interaction, that networking, which I know has happened to various degrees around here. But for everybody else's benefit, let me start off by formally introducing Chris as one of my mentors and friends since tail end of 2011. I've talked to some of you, certainly, if not many of you, fairly extensively about him. I introduced him as a classical philosophy teacher, a transformative astrologer, a memory keeper of ancient wisdom, and that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the number of different hats he's worn. I'm not quite sure if I had an objective for this evening, other than it was about time as we really transition into 5D that everybody got to meet you, Chris.
Well, it's nice to meet everybody, by the way. Some of the people I know and don't know.
So what I invited Chris to cover tonight was basically.
That's right.
Did I hear you, Michael? Who did I hear? Somebody else. Okay. So Chris had outlined a quick overview of the two world visions, the two world views, as we shift from one in 3D to the other in 5D, going over the Indigenous Elders' perspective of the Great Transition and the Great Purification, and largely from an astrology point of view, but from any point of view that you care to cover in terms of what the heck's happening to the world right now as we shift gears in the first week of April 2023, moving into 3D, moving into 5D. Yeah. So Chris, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Actually, in this case, it's a screen. The floor used to be things that we got. Now we get screens.
Okay.
Just as well, I suppose. So it's not very clear where to start with this, but I think maybe one of the easiest things is that there's an old history of the planet that the average teenager in an indigenous culture would have known before the age of colonization, when, if you think about it, the wiping out of the indigenous cultures was a very odd thing. And we always talk about it and say, I don't know about you, when I move into a neighborhood, my first instinct isn't to wipe out my neighbors. And so the question always was, well, why did they get rid of them? And one of the reasons is there's this very, very old history. And the problem with the history is, as far as the empires were concerned, is it has to do with the fact that the Earth is part of this massive, galactically important great transformation. And again, the average 6-year-old would have known this in the 12, 13, 1400s in indigenous culture, and would right now be bored and dozing off as I'm talking. The idea is, and of course, if you want to take over and be a king or an emperor or a dictator or something like that, you don't want people to know that there's a big transformation going on and they're all part of it, because then they don't need you to be a dictator and tell them what to do. So essentially, the history is roughly that around I normally would do this just for the Earth, but I can say the galaxies now because Gaia TV is dumping all kinds of disclosure stuff about all the secret space programs and so on that I used to know about as a consultant, but we never talked about because we were afraid of scaring the public. But since it's on Gaia TV, I think, yeah, what the heck. So the idea is that there's a big galactically important experiment happening on the Earth, because without identifying a group in the galaxy, there's this very controlling, violent mentality. And philosophically, it's based on the belief in separateness taken to an extreme. And the belief in separateness taken to an extreme is the need to consume without thinking about anything else. And when you have that belief, people can handle it all kinds of ways. They can feel interconnected. And in most cases, especially for tens of thousands of years on this planet, people didn't have that sense. The native indigenous cultures didn't have the idea that they were separate. They had an idea of this interconnected whole, and the environment provided everything they needed. They were integrated into the environment, so they didn't conceive of themselves as consumers. Right? So the history is that controlling mentality was making a mess of certain parts of the galaxy, which we know is a popular version of it is this Star Wars. And even the Indigenous Elders I talked to thought that was a joke, but a joke that happens to be slightly true. Without Harrison Ford, by the way. He's a latecomer. But this mentality was drawn to the Earth for a variety of reasons, but the Earth had agreed, along with the beings who were attracted here, to transform this mentality, not fight it, not try to destroy it. And nothing is more hopeless than the good versus evil scenario. And that actually plays into a belief in separateness, but rather to say, we're going to transform this from this very kind of controlling, dominator, separate, I need to consume you and don't care anything about you mentality into a more holistic partnership, interconnected mentality. And the idea was it's going to take a long time. Now, indigenous cultures and don't really think much in time. They think in narratives. So it doesn't matter how long it takes, it's what's the story that's being told. So if you ask the average, say, astronomer, tell me about the solar system, the first thing that, especially if she's got a degree in philosophy along with it, she'll say, well, we don't know why the planets actually group and get together. The mass equations aren't right. And I think most people that study astronomy know that. So the astronomers start to suspect that they're conscious and they like to be together. And that's, I think, the bleeding obvious. But as the astronomers would tell you, something happened roughly 900,000 years ago that a lot of planets that were in our solar system moved out of town. Something alarming really occurred. And the native people would say, well, that's easy. The controlling mentality showed up here at its worst. And what had happened was the humans here were drawn from all over the place. In fact, the native elders would say, you're very seldom going to find a native Earth person. They're from all kinds of parts of the galaxy. They were drawn here to try to help with what the elders called the Great Transformation. And those people were signing up for a very long job, because the 5-second version of the history was everybody's going to get together and plan this thing. And however long the planning took, the implementation was going to take that long as well. The planning took, and I'm going to use Hindu dating because, of course, my Hindu friends will say we're indigenous peoples, we're not a religion. A British court called Hinduism a religion sometime in the 1800s, and most of my Hindu friends resented that. Using the Hindu dating, they would say the actual transformation planning started 864,000 years ago, which in galactic terms is the blink of an eye. And the planning took 432,000 years. So the actual transformation started 432,000 years ago. Well, if you have a very nice, gorgeous, what indigenous peoples call a library planet, like the Earth, you're going to have these gorgeous experiences until this crowd shows up, and then you don't. If you had this sense of, okay, we have to tolerate all kinds of misery while we're slowly transforming this mentality, it's pretty brutal and violent at the beginning. So about 432,000 years ago, people agreed to settle more heavily into their physical bodies, what we call 3D. And that heaviness allows the memory to be wiped out of anything when you're born, with the exception of a few people dumb enough to sign up to be memory keepers. But that time period, it didn't mean that everybody would settle heavily into their bodies. And there are old teachings that some humans were still half in and half out as late as Atlantis before the sinking. So that's going to be 20 to 50,000 years ago, give or take. But by the time, the end of Atlantis, everybody's pretty much heavily into their bodies, not counting the higher dimensional beings like the great teachers in India that hide out in the Himalayas and so on. And I don't mean hide out in any negative way. So the idea was, when you come to the end of it, there will be something they call the Great Purification, where essentially it will be clear that, first of all, this is very successful because the controlling mentality will be very, very obvious. Instead of something that these are the natural rulers, or they're the gods, or they're the whatevers, people say these are just controlling crazy people. Right? And it would also be obvious that by the end of that time period, by what they call the Great Purification, 1975 to 2025, great teachers from the past would be very attracted to the planet, and they'd be sure to be here. And that number is a very large number. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands. And sure enough, from 1975 to 2025, the elders that I talked to said, yeah, a lot of the great teachers are back. They don't realize who they are many times. And I always mention that I'm reminded of Daniel Brinkley, the guy who had the near-death experiences. And he always said, after I had my near-death experiences, I always perceived humans as spiritual heroes. And in the great transformation history, the elders would say, yes, that's exactly what these people are, because they're not only doing extraordinary things, they don't even know why they're doing it. And they're having to put up with all kinds of crazy stuff. So in the fun conversation that I had when I was in college with them, was they said, well, the 1975 to 25, I was in college in the 60s. And no, it was none of the fun stuff that you see in television shows. It was just school. But the conversation they had, they said, the 1975 to 2025 thing is coming up. And it's going to be interesting because there will be these big events that'll get people's attention, but especially nobody's going to like 2020. They didn't know what it was. That nobody was going to like it. 2021 is a recovery, and 2022 is, okay, they start to realize that there's this separation that the native elders refer to as the two earths prophecy. And there are a variety of versions of that, but a lot of native peoples just take that for granted. And they talk about it in different ways, but the two earths is the way the Hopi elders talked about it that I knew. And they would say, you'll start to see this separation, and the symbols and the signs of the separation will be fairly obvious. That is to say, people will realize there are these big transitions. I'm moving away from things that I used to do that just feel more 3D or lower. I'm entering into these new relationships with the world around me. Sometimes it will feel new and different and exciting. Sometimes it's, oh my God, why am I putting up with this? Other times it'll just seem surreal. I mean, what's happening here? Trevor and I have talked to lots of people about this on Zoom, and then here for me in person academy seminars. And I've asked people, okay, what's going on? And people say a range of things. Their dreams are very different and jump out and often have two earth themes, or processing old stuff themes. And there's a lot of processing old things. I mean, last fall, some guide with bad taste decided it would be a good idea for me to relive over a period of a month all my childhood trauma. I thought it was a terrible idea, but apparently that whoever that was got the nod. And I'm sure you guys have had that too. So there's that. And then there's this growing sensitivity. And I wanted to try to get to this point as quickly as possible, because there's a group of empaths here. The idea would be the sensitivity toward all kinds of things in our environment, who we are, and even to higher dimensional phenomena is increasing rapidly. Now, without going into all the astrological details, within the last 2 years, we have had aspects that haven't happened in 600 years, 200 years, 165 years, and 12 years, all happening within a very short period of time. And one aspect that we've never seen before, simply because it's never happened in this moment in history. And a lot of the impact of that will be that people are having a sense of, okay, I'm suddenly realizing something higher dimensional. I had a funny example of it today. I had a client who was complaining that she's moving, and no, it's not Beth. Beth is on the road. This woman is moving, and she had to move this heavy box across her floor. And she said it was just so 3D to have to get up and carry that thing across the floor. And I said, what was the alternative? And she said, I had an image of it moving itself. I said, okay, you guys that know anything about the astral realm, you know in the astral, that's how things move. So I said, think of what's happening. What's happening is your higher dimensional astral self, how many higher dimensions you want to go, it's up to you, is coming down and giving you that perception here and now about moving that box, which you would not have thought twice about moving a year ago. And so there's that sensitivity to the higher dimensional. People are having all kinds of relationships to the earth, to stones, to plants, to animals or trees. I have a friend who said, I'm walking to work every day and I walk by all these gorgeous trees and I try to be friendly to trees, but all of a sudden he said, it's they're talking to me, but not through my mind. And I'm not sure what to make of it, but this is happening. And so that sensitivity is part of it because, I mean, an important part of it, a crucial part of it, because as the native elders would say, those people who are sensitive to, but also having this higher sense of what this higher consciousness should be, that actually is what's going to be defining the higher earth and the higher earth awareness. So it's being created right now. The good news is it's being created right now. The bad news is that's the cutting edge. So a famous sentence that Trevor would have already mentioned for pioneers, which we kept repeating in the original Academy class about the Great Transformation back in 2012 to 2016, all clear paths are behind you. There are very few more challenging things on this planet than all clear paths are behind you, because most people are watching to see what the pioneers are going to do. And by the way, criticizing them if they get it wrong and what that person thinks is the right thing to do. So you can be marginalized and criticized. I mean, you get the best of both worlds there. But you still have to figure out, okay, what are we going to do? You give things a shot and see how it's going. So this is a new cutting edge. And one helpful thing, because we always talk about the academy I run a classical academy, and Academy East and West always talk about tools and maps and methods. We never talk about truth or facts or anything like that. We figure people can work that out on their own. Our job is give them a map that might be helpful, or some method or some tool. Anything else would seem presumptuous to most classical teachers, including, by the way, Confucius, the Buddha, Socrates, Plato. And I'm not just picking a small group, it's a large group that really never talked in facts or truths at all. They always talked in tools and methods. And my academic colleagues always get that wrong. That's another story. But what we were talking about is, okay, how many maps or tools can we come up with? And sometimes other people's experiences help us kind of have a sense of what's happening. It becomes a kind of map for us. And one of the things about the cutting edge is to say, I'm going to go there and experiment and see what happens. And if you have highly developed sensitivities, as empaths do, you're getting feedback at a much wider, larger, greater range than people who wouldn't have those developed sensitivities. And so a lot of times you're going to be extraordinarily helpful, not only to your friends, but even to other pioneers, even if it's a random conversation. And I think a great deal of this, the challenge when people are talking about 3D to 5D, kind of completing the Great Transformation, is on one hand, what are the things that I leave behind that I don't have to take with me? And that's part of what people are talking about today. People saying, I never thought I'd quit that job, or I never thought I'd walk out of that relationship, or I never thought I would give up that approach to that. And I've had that. Because in the academy, I always used to like, my academy classes are small, so lots of discussion, but I still had an office up to about a year plus ago. And it was small enough that I'd put people in rows and I had a flip chart behind me. And suddenly I realized last year, this is too reminiscent of being in school when people think you have to have the right answer. And this is, if you're a pioneer, there is no such thing as the right answer until you get it right. Then you tell everybody you had it right because they don't know any better. So I took it down, I took it all down. I closed the office and I'd meet in people's homes and we sit in a circle. I don't bring the flip chart in. My sole ambition is I pass out a handout every now and then, which nobody pays any attention to. We just discuss what's happening. So Trevor, that's an introduction. I don't know what else you might want or need.
Well, certainly, actually, I don't know how much I have ever said to you, Chris, that back in 2011, the stuff that you would share in the academy blew me away. It was a case of, I don't understand what this guy is talking about. I don't know how much I agree with it, but it's just fascinating the breadth of vision that this guy has in terms of what comes out of his mouth. You've dumped a fair amount of that inside 20 minutes here. So what I'm saying to everybody is, Chris has blown me away, and I've been around him for 12 years now. So by all means, if you've got questions about all of that lot, or any one particular part of this, feel free to ask him questions. My one place that I'd like to start, Chris, is very evident in terms of, I kind of know where the answer's going when I say that. So with this lady who wanted to move the box across the room without picking it up and lifting it, that skill's coming in the not too distant future.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that it's kind of fun and exciting now. It's a bit abstract, but when people talk about higher dimensions and higher dimensional guides, like people say, my teacher's from the 49th dimension or mine's from the 144th. Well, it depends on how you count them, of course. We always say that. I mean, how many dimensions are in my body? It depends on how I count it. But in traditional societies, they're counted as 7. And astral is the next one up, and the one after that is kind of very activist. The one after that is focused on creativity and creative expression, because that's what transforms a culture. In fact, that's a fun thing to do. If terrestrial is where things happen, that's this level, and I'm going to just use traditional names. The astral level is where people go, they recycle when they die, and they just want to come back here. But it's the place from which things look ideal. Right? Because if we think just normally, if you think, well, I wish this place looked nicer, according to what? Because all the ideals we have in our head aren't, out there. I mean, not counting beautiful forests and stuff like that, but I mean, the ideal world isn't there, but it's at the astral. Everything, if you go to the astral right now, if I safe dropped on my head and I ended up there, everything would look gorgeous and finished and complete and so on. And those ideals, when they're visited on terrestrials, that means you're contacting your higher dimensional self that lives in that realm. The one above that is very activist oriented. Let's get the job done and so on. And I've consulted activist groups. I was reminded vividly 2 days ago. I looked up an old contract I had. And that's from that level. We're going to be this selfless, get the job done type. The level above that is where you get all kinds of creativity, from art to the alchemical. And that's a source of real change. And so the activists that I work with that are very successful have to tap into that creativity rather than trying to force or persuade people. The level above that is this kind of holistic awareness. And the level above that is multiverses and infinite things possible. And I remember, and above that is celestial. If you higher than that, you don't have any form to be here. And I remember the old theosophists used to say, the average human can't understand the top 2 or 3 levels. Well, one of those is you have very holistic knowledge. Well, we all think in whole systems without any trouble at all. And the Buddha would think that's brilliant, by the way. Thinking in whole systems is half of what the Buddha thought was enlightenment. But multiverses, Trevor and I have joked about this a couple of times. We have a multiverse movie with Doctor Strange. We have a Spider-Man multiverse movie. Then we had a second Doctor Strange multiverse movie. These are Marvel movies for kids, right? This is the 6th dimension. If the kids can get it, pretty good shot that, we all have access to our higher dimensional selves. And one of the predictions for this time was we're going to start talking to those more and more. And that's why I was so amused when she said that when we were talking today, that she said, oh yeah, I just had this image. And isn't that the way things should really move? Just have the image that they move and they move. And I said, well, that sounds like a description I've heard many times about the astral realm. I used to do past life regression a lot more than I do now. And people would describe what it's like to be in the astral. But that's the other thing. There are things that we think are normal human responses or skills that are really higher dimensional elements. And I remember when I was in my 20s, I had a Hindu teacher, because I taught the world religions. I wanted to not just study academics. I tried to go study with people who were actually in the religion. And this Hindu teacher used to say, he'd point at me and he'd say, this is what that your higher dimensional Atman looks like right now. That's what it looks like. But it's just a vehicle. And Trevor knows, he used to say, it's just a vehicle, Chris. Sometimes it'll move quickly in the left lane and you're happy camper. Sometimes it gets stuck in the middle and you think, why am I stuck in the middle? I think there's a rock song about that. Sometimes it'll go down the right lane and it's fine. You're going a little more slowly. Sometimes it'll run off the road. You'll drive over a squirrel and feel terrible, or get a flat tire, put the thing back on the road and get going again. And so, but he also thought there's this moment when all these higher dimensional selves will start to communicate much more. And the native elders would say that's when the 2 Earths prophecy starts to be fulfilled. And as far as their symbols are concerned, that would be last summer and last fall that it started.
So I could ask for a show of hands in terms of, I've been talking to everybody in terms of, yep, it's getting really intense right now. It's getting intense on a daily basis. And it's a case of, I'm almost tempted to ask for a show of hands how many of you feel like this can't go on like this for more than a couple of weeks before I join the other people opting off the planet. I think Veronica's there right now. Chris, you've talked about changes coming in the second week in April. Give us an outline for what's happening for the rest of this year.
Well, it actually started last August, the symbols for the 2 Earths prophecy, and in astrological terms, it's because Mars was in Gemini, but it's retrograded at the tail end of its run. So from late October to third week in January, energy was really kind of slow, confused. Things appeared not to move. It was like walking through mud or something like that. And astrologers would talk about that. That wouldn't be unusual to have happen. But this was just unusually kind of slogging, and I need to get rid of this and I can't do that. But that energy started to pick up as Mars completed its coming out of its cycle and out of its shadow in the middle of last month. And then Jupiter has a cycle, and so that energy feels it's picking up now. And right now the energy is very sensitive. By the way, Mars is in Cancer, and it doesn't like being in there. Mars wants to take a sword and hit somebody, and in Cancer it feels like baking a cake. So it's kind of, off. But it's nice and it's nurturing and it's caring. And if you're an empath, it's softer energy. But it's also energy, by the way, where you try to figure out where the edges of your emotions are, where the boundaries are, and so on. It's helpful for defining that this month. But the other biggie is that Jupiter was with the Sun in Pisces just a little over a year ago. And the energy there was, what are my highest goals and ideals? And that also, Jupiter's hanging around Neptune as well in Pisces. This is high goals and ideals, the spiritual business, everything big. But now Jupiter's coming, it's going to join the Sun. The middle of this month, there's going to be a solar eclipse, so something like the 20th or 21st. And the Sun and Jupiter are going to be hanging around before that. This is big. Every 12 years, Jupiter's in Aries with the Sun, and it says, this is great for pioneering. What are the new things you want to start? It starts building this energy in the spring that goes into the summer. And so for starting something new, for regaining enthusiasm, and also it's in Aries. It's what don't you want to do? You leave that behind. And interestingly, I have lunch once a month with several guys, and one is America's best futurist. He keeps winning the awards. And so I always check in with him about astrological trends and what he's seeing, and he started saying, I'm starting to take this two earths thing very seriously from the models I have, but I see this spring and summer as one of the lightest energies we've seen in years. There can be, and this is a good time to initiate and to start building up the energy. And he and I have talked about it, that even the symbolism we're looking at is, okay, where are there places where we're going to, if we think of various intelligences we have, where the physical intelligence is such that we want our bodies to be healthier and more active, or the emotions where we want to work with the emotional stuff and say, okay, we want that to be lighter and more committed, the intellect to get clearer and more disciplined so that it doesn't get sucked in by programming or thought forms. And then the intuition, the imagination, the imaginal is the one that's open to the highest experiences we have, what we call the spiritual or the mystical or the magical or whatever. And that's one that was shut down in school because it wasn't trained. And well, neither was the body, neither were the emotions. And those were all supposed to stay home. But now that I think that opens up in a much bigger way as well. And so that energy for letting the imagination run and see what you want to commit to that's new and exciting and different in the spring and into the summer. Then when the retrograde started in the fall, there's this rethinking of everything we initiated. So it's this very interesting strategic moment where you think, okay, I'm going to try this. Jupiter in Aries, it's pioneering, it's a pioneering sign. And Jupiter symbolizes big and expansive. Aries, let's go forward. So I'm going to try this and try that and try this and try that. And then in the fall, say, okay, how do I rethink this? Let me sit back and do a little pioneer review. Now, some of these things don't have to be big and exciting. You know, these are things that can be very, many can be small and subtle. In fact, there's a channeled source that Trevor knows I like because I've known it for years, and it's fairly reliable. And Cosmic Awareness has said, people that don't go with the upper earth, the changes that are coming in the culture are going to be devastating. For people who kind of go part of the way, it's going to be challenging. For people who go to the upper earth, the changes are going to be subtle and sometimes even exciting. And these people they're living in 3 different realities, even if it seems to be the same planet. And by the way, the native elders were hopeless on the details of the upper earth. I'd say, okay, is this you're talking about 2 planets? And for a long time they said that. And there's actually somebody on this call who had a visit to a higher planet. We were doing a regression into the future, which was a lot of fun back in 1992. Or is it 2 timelines? Is it this county's one and that county's the other? They have no details. But the interesting thing about pioneers is we're used to living without details. So we'll think, okay, let's see what happens.
You mean your entryway into the new earth doesn't depend on which way you voted in the last election? Joke.
Trevor knows that part of my work is I'm a political consultant. And by happy accident, I got to be considered a high-class political consultant, which I am not, because I happened to give an address to the World Future Society chapter in Washington, D.C. So they thought, oh, anybody who's addressing us, because the Washington, D.C. chapter of the World Future Society is a bunch of men who they look to be about 130 years old. They all smoke cigars, wear 3-piece suits, and came out of the womb that way. And when I was there in October of 2001, they were very happy to say they had discovered 2 things: women and young people. And I said, wow, a real Columbus moment. Anyway, what happens is that consultants will, at a certain level, you'll know who the president is going to be 4 or 8 years in advance because they groom them. And you know all the signs of who's going to be doing that. And there are only about 3 surprises in the last 60 years of somebody they picked, but ended up not being president. But so yeah, I would say about voting is, if you're voting for the president and you think that vote is going to make a difference, it probably won't. However, if there's a powerful human consciousness behind that, that will make a difference. So when people ask me, you know, what do you feel about voting? That's it. They already picked a person, and so far it's always been a guy. But we have the joke of this century, the consultants, we had a white guy, a black guy, and an orange guy. So we're due for one day now.
And you bring up the point there, Chris, that yeah, the discussion so far is really good brain candy. And the fact is we're changing the world by just gathering together and raising consciousness together. And that is more important than the words we're sharing.
Yeah.
Or at least as important.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's usually a surprise to Westerners is that the Russians and Eastern Europeans started studying very sophisticated forms of intuition in the 1930s under Stalin. By the 60s and 70s, they had thousands of experiments showing that empathic sensitivity, various forms of psychic experiences, intuition, and so on, were absolutely the case. But Eastern Europe, as we all know, was materialist atheist in those days. So you weren't allowed to talk about the spiritual or the psychic or anything. If you did, you'd end up spending your vacation breaking rocks in Siberia. So what the scientists had to do was come up with a whole lot of very sophisticated field theories, which is exactly, of course, what Einstein and Planck and Heisenberg and the scientists were doing here with new physics. And then it was introduced to biology twice in the 20th century, Ludwig von Bertalanffy and then Rupert Sheldrake, so that we realized you have these interacting fields that go all over the planet. So if you have a great, big, powerful insight, and it doesn't have to be intellectual, it can be anywhere, that big, powerful impact, that's like throwing a stone into a pond, and it ripples out and changes the whole planet. It changes the lives of people you'll never meet, unless you have time to, meet 8 billion people. But
So who's got questions for Chris here?
I have a question. I'm afraid to ask it. It's like, so here's my question for you. So, how, we're empaths and sensitive, intuitive. How does one continue to assure that whatever purity is in that is sustainable in the world that's transitioning right now? I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but I have, obviously I have a lot of people that I know in a very large city, and we're surrounded by anger and fast drivers and people flipping you off, and anger. And so yeah, when I say the purity of it, and I know Trevor talks about the projector, which I work on, but as we continue to kind of move forward, it feels like there's so much coming at you to try to keep you from exercising your skills, your talents, and what you're meant to do. So is there a force of battle for that right now? I understand, and I do acknowledge, I think there's stuff happening that is, for me, it's relaxing a little bit more, and I do feel like I'm moving forward now. It's not as hard for me. But I don't know, does that make sense? I hope that was logical.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is we're all doomed. So that was that. But usually, one of the things, and Trevor and I talked a lot about this, especially back in 2011, is it's the context. And in this case, when you have a context of a transformation, it's looking at the experience and saying, okay, which of those things, especially for the upper earth, do I release and relinquish? As Bearhart, the teacher, used to say, you can release the thing, but also relinquish it, let it go, and don't have anything invested in it. Or things that I kind of stay away from, I move away from, that also is part of the upper earth. There are also times within the transformation when you think, okay, what's this about? So for instance, the woman I was talking to today, in her chart, she has this very prominent Venus in Aries. And so she said, I get angry about things. I get so angry. And I said, well, how about if we kind of go down the list of the things you get angry about. Is any one of those a transformation point? And sometimes it's just old-fashioned annoyance and irritation. I'm an Aquarian. I have a lot of Aquarian planets, and we love annoyance and irritation. It's one of the ways we process human beings. Yes, that's annoying, or it's interesting. And it's just kind of a response that says you're responding to this person. It doesn't really mean very much. But if I get angry, really bothered about something, it would be, am I supposed to move away from that? And it's good because these are pioneering questions. The beauty of your question, it's a great open question, and we don't know what the answer is. But it's saying, I know there are things that I figure that's just not mine to deal with. Trevor also knows I had an old metaphysical teacher. I was a little too involved in trying to help people when I was younger. And so he used to say, what do you think, Chris? Should we save this person or leave him to God? And I should say, is that a trick question? But I think it's for each of us to try to figure out, okay, is this something, when something niggles at me, I will eventually say, okay, I'm supposed to go do something about it. What is it? And especially if it's an emotional niggle, because our emotional intelligence is very smart, but they very seldom talk to us in ways that aren't slightly annoying. Things like anger and grief and irritation and so I think, okay, how about a little elation today or something like that? Or I was looking for happiness this morning. Of course, they know I won't do anything about happiness, so it's I get the other. So I think it's kind of, especially for the two Earths, it's a great question, because that's the short form without going into the astrological detail. Is there's a thing called the Venus star point that is usually ruled by one planet for 100 years. From 1926 to last October, it was ruled by Mars. Anything feel Martian about any of you women living in a patriarchy with bombs and wars since 1926? Right? Okay, yeah. Well, in October, late October of last year, it went into Venus. I went into a sign ruled by Venus. So all of a sudden, we're asking, some of the questions are, what are the Venusian strategies? Because there's a sense in which we're all good at Martian strategies. We know how to be dutiful, strategic, responsible, get the job done, do it because we have to do it, got the t-shirt, know how to do all that. Now it's saying, well, what is the Venusian version of that? In the Academy, we keep quoting Rumi's famous line, God guides us by our loves. Well, when Venus is dominating the Venus star point, it's by our loves. And the last time it was doing this, people were asking themselves a big question. And the question was, do you think we really need a king? Because the Venus star point was around in the 1770s. And in America, people were saying, we're going to have a better time without a king annoying us and telling us what to do. And what people often don't remember about the American Revolution was that this was a whole new idea that the communities could do it themselves. And most of the American Revolution was about ideas. Not that many people were fighting in it. And what we also forget is that the British commanders all wanted to lose the war because they agreed with the Americans. That's why their military is so pathetic, and military historians have commented on that. But we had that big so that was a big idea in those days. Let's do it without a king or an emperor or a queen or somebody telling us what to do. The question is, what's the big idea now? And I suspect it has something to do with things like inner authority, but with Venus and Libra, the star point has to do with beauty and joy and harmony. Well, if you say that, somebody's going to think you're either Pollyanna or you really don't get out enough or something. But what if those become real criteria? And, it's one thing to say, I wish things were better. I know they're miserable and horrible. That's a very Mars-Venus star point. But you say, no, hold it. They could be beautiful.
My friend Veronica just heard that, didn't you? He said, Pollyanna. That worked.
You've been a Pollyanna for years.
And I think another Venusian point that I'd like to make is, without going into sacred geometry in any kind of detail, the golden proportion that the classical world took very seriously, and that's from India to Greece. There's a way that you can think about the golden proportion that underlies everything. The way galaxies are made, the way the earth is made, the shapes of our bodies, how we create, the spaces we live in, roughly the size of this, the things our faces are in is a golden proportion. And credit cards are this shape. This is a shape that people took very seriously right through the Renaissance and said, you might have big problems. I mean, they had kings and emperors. They had popes that fought with swords in the Renaissance, so they had problems. But they said, what happens is you have a universe, the golden proportion tells us, of beauty and harmony. Therefore, in our lives, that means regeneration, learning, and problems are going to get solved. The only thing you don't want to fall into is a good guys versus a bad guys. That's the old Martian piece. The Venusian piece is, no, let's do something different. And so the question is, what does that look like when, the golden proportion dropped out of math when in the age of colonization? And dictators didn't want that either. We don't want people to know that there's a mathematical guarantee of harmony and beauty, and that's the way that things are. Plants grow that way, and so on. There are brilliant books on this. But Venus is very much involved in that.
So, Chris, when people talk about lower frequencies, higher frequencies, in old terminology, good versus bad, good versus evil, you see that very much as a 3D mindset. Really, we need to move away from that mindset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always like Gandhi's famous quote. He said, I could fight somebody on the outside, but I have so many devils running around inside me that I have to fight. I'm going to leave the battle to that. And he always thought, do the psychological development, and that'll take care of it. But I think that is one. There's another difference. The Mars-Venus star point in 1926. Think of it, there were world wars then, and following World War II, we had Korea and Vietnam and right? But the Venusian one would be, well, now hold it. What does it mean to have a universe where you are dealing with interconnectedness and so on? So somebody that annoys me, I might think, okay, yeah, that's annoying, but what's this about? And I'm still connected to that person in some way. In fact, we used to have a joke, my brother and sister and I. She was a New Age liberal Democrat. He was a born-again Christian conservative, and I was a political consultant. So we had these political conversations, and we agreed what we used to call a Confucian relationship, because Confucius used to define relationships in certain ways that made them functional. And one of them is you keep a nice, pleasant Confucian distance. She lived in Alabama, he lived in California, and I live in Pennsylvania. And we talked on the phone all the time, once a year. So we got along just great. It's a very Venusian sort of strategy.
Everybody deserves to be loved. Some people deserve to be loved from a long way away. What other questions you got for Chris? Chrissy, I know everything's perfect in your world, so you're not worried about 5D getting here at all, as long as it gets here by Monday.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the pioneering things. I've always worked with pioneers, which means my budget is what you would call fluid in the extreme, right? You never really know whether there's going to be any money there. Right? I think, yeah, that's one of my things. And I also think, I have a suspicion that good pioneers have pretty miserable childhoods. There's something going on in there that really challenged them as kids, because if they came in with this perfect world, they wouldn't want to pioneer to change it. They tell you, I had the perfect parents, all this. Yeah, I didn't have hardworking parents. But it wasn't a very nice childhood. And one of the things that I like as a Venusian point is that the woman whose apartment I'm sitting in right now, I've been seeing for almost 2 years exactly, known her for 10 years. We really admired each other. But because of my childhood, it was particularly nasty at night. And so I never slept at night. I would get up and walk around, and I'd wake up in 2 hours and then go back to sleep in another. And if I got 3 to 5 hours a night, I was in good shape. I never slept soundly until Mary and I got together. And I've slept 9 hours and more every night for the last 2 years. And my body is trying to get used to it, to say, this is this wonderful person you're with, but what are you supposed to do with all that sleep? Right. And so it's a very Venusian thing. Last fall, I realized that, and Mary and I were talking about it, and I was saying, yes, and I also am struggling with being this extraordinarily independent Aquarian, and Mary's an extraordinarily independent Aquarian, but we want to be together all the time, thinking, okay, what's that about? But I think the worst thing is the biggest challenge for me is Mary's an award-winning ballroom dancer and rides a motorcycle. Guess which two things I'm learning now? I'm doing better with the motorcycle than the ballroom dancing, I'll admit, just right off the top.
As long as you don't try waltzing with a motorbike in your arms.
But yeah, Trevor and I are always talking about, well, what are the challenges of moving the professions forward and everything else? There's always, it reminds me of P.G. Woodhouse's thing. It's kind of like what is it? The things that make oysters make pearls, is that right?
Yeah.
And they have to constantly be irritated. So he said, to create that pearl, it's just one damn thing after another. Sometimes I feel that way.
Michael, this is probably, you're possibly the newest person to all of this information. How are you doing there? Can we hear you? You're on mute at the moment. There you go.
I'm just taking it all in. It's interesting. So I'm just sitting, listening, and taking it all in.
Cool. So Chris, in his government consulting days in Washington, used to make good use of the word interesting.
Right. Yeah.
Would you like to put a context around that, Chris?
Well, I think I think one of the things that I think being in Washington, there are two things that jump out at you. And first is that you're dealing with a very serious number of power addicts. And I once asked a senior consultant, what do you guys really think about, you're in DC all the time, what do you really think about the politicians? And famously, he used the line that all consultants know, if you have a lot of clowns, you're going to have a circus, he said. And what happens is in DC, you realize there's this kind of manipulation of the public and to try to kind of make it seem as if everything is the way the news presents it. So all kinds of very strange things come up. Some are more obvious than others. The less obvious is that trillions of your dollars are being spent on secret space programs and secret super soldier programs. And we've been all over many planets, and that's being dumped on Gaia TV, as I mentioned earlier. And because it is, often I will say to people, if you want a little surprise, there are lots of, there are whistleblowers there as well as other kinds of classes. But these are things I never thought the public would be exposed to, not this early. But so one thing is about that we're dealing with a galactic worldview that almost every government knows about. And that means that they're aware of the fact that there's some bigger thing going on this planet. And that is what happened. A lot of super soldiers don't know much about the transformation history, and I don't talk about it to certain groups because I want them to let me know how they're experiencing it. And they will say, there's the Earth is some big, very important something happening here. There's a big transformation. There's the Earth experiment, it's often referred to as, and it has big galactic implications, and humans are doing bigger things than they think. So that's interesting. And then the other thing is this attempt to always keep one side against the other. So when I was in DC, spent most of my time, a little bit late Clinton, but mostly the two younger Bush administrations, which is very interesting. And one of the things about that was the press and the party heads were starting to create the red states versus the blue states. And what's more, try to find very divisive candidates and try to have people kind of doing this all the time. And I was impressed by the fact that the people in DC, the staffers, didn't really fall for it. And a great deal of the public did not. Because a lot of the public is just too savvy. They realize, okay, somebody's messing with us. Because anybody who thinks that those two people running for president are the best we can do, and we can't get a woman to run because because we know women are a minority, they outnumber the men. So the logic is completely lost on everybody, right? But there are lots of they're the sorts of things that you'd realize in the Great Transformation. The work is going to be done by people in the communities and how their consciousnesses affect the field. It's not going to come from institutions because they're not real. And we do have a one-liner in the Academy about institutions, was from the Wizard of Oz, that familiar sentence, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain, that's great and powerful Wizard of Oz. Well, actually, no, it's a bunch of guys, usually guys, trying to get away with something, calling it politics or economics or foreign policy or whatever. And so it's very different from what is on the news. And fortunately, in the 80s, I was on the board of a media watchdog group, just because a whole bunch of journalism professors, concerned citizens, and investigative reporters asked me if I were dumb enough to join to do research on unpleasant projects. In this case, it was subliminals. And one of the most depressing things I ever studied, what the public is subjected to on a daily basis. But media watchdog groups already realized that, we're kind of being conned. But I think the public was aware of it. The more people I talked to, they said, "Oh, I don't really watch news. I don't really take it too seriously," or anything like that. And I was very impressed with the staffers in DC. Very hardworking people who really wanted to do good stuff for the public. And to be fair, most of my consulting was at the Labor Department. So I wasn't at state or anything like that. That's a little bit more of a place where you're not sure whether your tax dollars are being well spent. They are in the Labor Department. But yeah, there's always a lot going on when you consider, and I think this is the big shocker for most people, a government is not necessary. Indigenous cultures for tens of thousands of years on this planet never had one. No human planet has a government. No human planet has an economy except this one. No human planet has police except this one. No human planet has a military except this one. And those are the things, again, that are slowly leaking out. But if the indigenous cultures didn't need them, why would anybody else? And so that's part of this kind of trying to convince people that there's a need for these institutions, and there really isn't. If you have higher human consciousness, you end up having Plato's idea 2,400 years ago, because he was so brilliant that both political parties wanted him, and he wouldn't join either. And in the end, he said, as an older man, politics is not the solution, it's the problem. Philosophy, love of wisdom, higher consciousness is a solution. And I think we're much more aware of that today than people were in Plato's time. You sure are aware of it if you're a political consultant.
So Natalie, I know you're really disappointed at the idea of all the patriarchal institutions disappearing.
Yes, it's a terrible thing. We're going to have a funeral for them any day now, I hope.
And Natalie will be there with the first box of matches.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I mean, I'm hearing some things tonight that I've never heard before, and it's just fascinating. Like, I want to know more. I'm like, where can I go read all this stuff? I think, Trevor, you mentioned the term brain candy. That's what's going on in my brain right now. My brain is just going over and over what you said. So, yeah.
So, okay, Chris, that would be an intro into talking about your newsletter, talking about the Seventh Academy, how often you meet, what are you doing in your spare time, Chris?
Well, the Seventh Academy is really just a fancy name for people who are local around here who meet in person 2 Saturdays a month, and Wednesday night on Zoom at 6. Usually we're having subjects that anybody wants to talk about from 6 to 7 on Wednesday nights. And I will record them for people who want to be on the list and they like the subject. But a lot of it now is especially discussions about the two earths and the pioneering. I mean, what are the tools we need? And sometimes it's a perspective. I mean, that was the thing about that, about where can I learn more? Well, when we kind of peel away this very funny kind of facade about American culture, and you start looking at the whole planet, you think, okay, there's a whole lot of very interesting stuff going on that they never taught us in school. And always makes me feel like, did you ever see the film Pleasantville, where the kid goes back and everything is in black and white? And he wants to be back in the 50s and so on, but he and his sister go and they change everything, and people start to see in color. It's very fun. It's a Gary Ross movie. He's someone who wrote Dave, and it's a really interesting movie. But it's kind of like that. It's saying, okay, this is just this crazy facade, and you start looking behind it. All these very interesting things are happening, and the galactic history is a very big deal. The psychic discoveries are a very big deal. The creative potential of humans. And one of the things we're starting right now is that there's a famous book written in the 1930s about play, that human culture really advances through very sophisticated forms of play. And the criteria that the man who wrote it is highly respected, because most people didn't write multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary books in the 1930s. You stuck to your profession and your academic discipline. But this guy wrote a book called Homo Ludens, and ludens, of course, is a Latin word for play. But his criteria are that when people play, they're doing it freely. It's not for productive purposes. It's in some practical materialist purpose. It involves creative energy, it involves a creative imagination, and so on. Sometimes it can be very serious, like chess or football. Other times it's like kids playing. But that whole model gives us a different way of thinking about an Earth where we have a Venus star point and not a Mars star point. Because under the Mars, we're thinking, I've got to get up every morning and be hardworking, responsible, and at the end of the day, I have a list of things that I accomplished. And the Venus says, you know, did you have fun? Did you do something you loved? Did you run into more beauty? And I remember and I'm terrible at this, by the way, just so you know, I was a terrible workaholic. Since I loved everything I did, I worked these god-awful 60 to 80-hour weeks until about 2 years ago, when Mary and I got together. And the other day I found I live in a log cabin on top of this hill. And there's one of these wooden swing benches out front. And I realized that Mary and I were sitting out there in the sun, slightly cold, but nice and sunny, for something like 2 hours. Okay, well, 2 years ago, I thought, you can't just sit here for 2 hours. You've got to go do something, right? Get out there and do something. And now I'm thinking, no, that was really great to sit there for 2 hours. That was really important in some way that I can't possibly explain.
So Sherry, let me check in with you. How are you doing there? What questions do you have?
Thanks. Hi, Trevor. Nice to meet you. Chris, I'm doing good. I was getting over the COVID, and I'm starting to get back on my feet. Thank you for asking. I am now experiencing more of the Venus part of all of this, where I'm feeling a lot of the beauty. I've been doing a lot of what's the word? I don't know. I've been in helping organizations better the planet and things like that. And I don't know. I don't think I'm in a pea cloud. I'm in a good place. I'm in a really good place. I'm not experiencing the problems or the transitions we're having right now. I'm seeing beautiful things and beauty in everything. I am going through the change period where I've tried some different things. I just started a class in graphic design, which I never thought I would be doing, but I am, and I love it. And I've just been very artistic lately, just making things and painting things and all kinds of stuff. that's right now where I am. And I love it. I'm very happy and it's very beautiful.
Nice.
So, yeah, I love it. It's great. I've had the challenge of protecting myself. I really have to protect myself when I go places lately. And it seems like just what you guys said, where it's a challenge out there because people are so negative. It's so, everyone out there is looking down and they're, trying to avoid human contact. And it's really sad. It's very sad out there, but I'm trying to not absorb those feelings of those people that I get. So other than that, everything, I have nothing to complain about. I came out of the little flu pretty good, and I have no complaints.
Thanks, Sherry.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Don't know him.
Chrissy, would you like to share actually your reaction to reading Three Waves of Volunteers and the New Earth?
Sure. So Trevor turned me on to that book at the beginning of the pandemic or whatever it was. And I think I don't remember, Trevor, it might have been a chapter or two. I had to put it down because my soul felt so aligned with it that I had to like absorb it. I cried, I rejoiced. I was, there's like all these emotions and I flew through it. And I remember it was like, oh my goodness, I get it. Like all the things I felt in my lifetime, like not belonging, or why am I here, or what am I doing? Am I doing anything? And the not belonging and feeling like I'm from outer space. And it just answered all that for me. And I found myself at peace for a little while till, the next growth spurt happened. And then I was back in turmoil again. But it was a very profound read. And of course, Trevor, you're always intuitive of what I need in the moment. So it came at the right time.
Hey, stuff pops into my world, and there's Chrissy an hour or two later for her weekly or bi-weekly session, and it's a case of, oh, have I got the perfect update for you, Chrissy?
I think I texted you like once a day at least. Like my mind is just blown.
But I keep saying it is we're spiritual beings having a human experience. And as such, compared to being spiritual beings having a spiritual experience, having a human experience just sucks. Veronica nodding her head vigorously on that one.
Yeah, I've whatever this transition is from a physical perspective, I would really, really almost like not to be in a human experience, because there's been a lot of shit the last 2 years, and I think I'm coming out on the other side of it. But it started out with, hey, you got immaculate generation, right? You have to understand my history. 6 decades on this earth, no problems, no pain, no nothing. I have been blessed. Hey, you got immaculate generation. I'm like, okay. And then my teeth, which right now I'm getting restored. So had teeth extracted, had implants done. And I've had hip pain. It's like, oh, now you're hip, you need a hip implant. I'm like, it's like, Trevor and I talk a lot about the people who are opting off the planet because of the energy. And I never understood that until probably the last 6 months. I'm not opting out, but I certainly can see that the energy, Trevor says I have, according to Chris, we have till the end of April. Is that right, Chris? Where it's going to start maybe just a little bit less intense. I've actually been becoming more 3D, and that really bothers me. I don't know where that's coming from, and I would appreciate any advice, because I worked with many of you, and everything helps. And then I jump back into 3D and then I go up higher and I go lower. It just seems like I'm all over the place. Maybe that's just a Gemini in me. I don't really know. So.
Well, it's interesting, Veronica, because I was once teaching this class about the two worldviews. I used to do this for my university students, and I'd draw a picture that represented the more holistic and represented the more atomistic. And when they start to talk, I'd say, well, which worldview do you want me to stand in front of? What are we talking about here? But essentially, the transformation is moving in one direction. There's always something more holistic. Well, there was this 14-year-old kid in a class that I was teaching, this brilliant kid, and he said, you know, if you're a transformer, you have to go back and forth between those two all the time to know what you're doing, don't you? I thought, out of the mouth of babes, or in this case, 14-year-old teenagers, right? I thought, yeah, and that's one of the things that I think happens. And I remember being warned by the native elders about that. Because I have a bunch of air planets, and Uranus and Gemini is one of them, and it's that back and forth thing, and sometimes very fast when you have that energy, very fast. I think I was enlightened there for a moment. Now, right, boom.
Exactly. It's like, oh, I'm just, la la la, and then
Yeah.
it's like, no, wait a minute. I'm like, would you stop, please? I just want to continue. I want to continue up. I don't want to keep going down side. And then I started thinking, there's something to be learned here. There's something to be learned, and there's something to move forward to. So
yeah, this may not be much help, but there's an old teaching, and it turns up in several traditions. It says, well, you guys are the great transformers on the earth. You're learning to do that because the next thing that happens when it's all done here, you're going to be moving all over the galaxy, helping people transform things. And you have these very sophisticated skills, and the hardest job anywhere else in the galaxy will seem like child's play to the transformers on this planet. And they say, well, you're always going to be employed, but you don't have to worry about that. They don't have economic systems and everything's available. But they would say a lot of times you're just honing the skills to a very high level, because people who aren't really transformers would kind of just throw in the towel or say, okay, that was a defeat. I was just, rather than saying, okay, what is this? And that's a good transformer question. And the beauty of classical learning and classical academies is everything's an open question. And when you have a good question, that's a great question. And if I keep asking myself that, something's going to come out of it. That's Plato's strategy with 30-some dialogues. He never gives an answer, right? I used to annoy my students, and I said, no, this guy's more fun than you think he is. Very funny guy. So is Socrates. But it's that an open question means I'm going to keep looking at it until something comes out of it. And that just gives us greater skills. And on this is going to sound fairly crazy, but when this first started on the earth, as opposed to earlier things that I said that sounded crazy, when this first started, people said, we don't think this is going to work, right? And I said, oh yeah, sure it is. Got all these teams of people all over there, they're brilliant, this is going to work. And it's a standard joke. You come to the end of it, and it's like the heroes in the movie saying, this is going to work, let's go do that. And then when it works, the hero says, I didn't think that was going to work. And so what you have, you come to the end and think, my God, that did work. But look at the work it was, and look at the skills that everybody has. Well, other galaxies started watching here. And we're their documentaries and TV shows. And they look at it and they think, how do they do that? Where do they get those skills? How do they handle that way? And especially when it's something that to us, it looks challenging, Veronica, like what you just said. To them, it looks dead impossible. And they'll watch the humans and they'll come back and say, okay, that's how they handle it. That's amazing. And so not much help, because we'll appreciate how wonderful this is sometime in the future.
well, and it does. I mean, I started with Trevor, and then I started in the classes with, doing the academy. And it's just, I worked with Chrissy, I worked with Beth. Everything happens and it kind of moves you along to the next level, and you take things and you're like, oh, there's that modality, and you start forming your own, I don't know what to call it, your own something. And you pull from everyone, and then you form your own next level, which I guess is exactly what you're saying. So it's just when you have 6 decades of basically going, and then you're told, oh, now you have to do the work. And you think, oh, I don't need to do the work. I've never had to do the work. I've just kind of skimmed along for the last 6 decades. And it's like, nope, work time. And I'm like, so no, you've been incredibly helpful. And I'll be back at the Academy starting tomorrow night again.
Thank you.
And I suggest everybody check it out. Seriously. It's amazing.
Yeah, and that was a nice summary, Veronica, what you said about and how you approach it. That was good. I hope you heard yourself.
I hope I did. Trevor recorded it. Maybe he'll send it to me. So
Hey, you're on the recording. Beth, I know you've heard all of this lot before, but just checking in with you. How you doing there?
You can hear me. I can't see myself.
That's okay. That's okay. We've got the top of your head.
yeah, we got the top of your head, dear.
And so this is off the top of my head. How about that? When it was being spoken about the Venusian part and the appreciation and what are we seeing, I drove out of the desert on, I don't even know what day it was, Friday. And it's a desert, it's a desert through Arizona, through New Mexico. Oh my God, West Texas. And all of a sudden, on my second day, because I stayed over in Midland, Texas. And I'm from the Northeast. It's not like I didn't live this way before, but I've been in the desert for 6 years. And the median had green grass growing on the highway. The median it's green, it's grass. Then there's grass on the right side. And I don't know, Sherry, you understand this. And on the right side is now grass with blue bonnets and orange flowers. And then it gets even more. There's trees on hills. And then I was actually listening, the synchronicity of this wasn't lost. I was listening to Ben Zander, and I think it was the ninth, Beethoven's Ninth. And I've listened to it enough that I know what's coming next. When I went through one area on the highway, it opened up that I was in a valley and mountains with trees and green were there. And it was right before that the Ode to Joy started. And all I could think of was, fuck yes. I mean, it was just like all times, because all I could feel was, I'm no longer visiting this kind of area. I'm going to be living in it. And the Ode to Joy, I have never been so excited to hear it. So that's how I'm experiencing. And all I know is that I feel like intuitively things, not being in the desert, I feel different. So as people are talking about the second, the higher earth and I was on the road 10 hours today. I visited Louisiana by accident, but I spent I did. But I feel like I'm living it in my car as I'm moving. So this is a pretty interesting time for me.
Nice.
But the Ode to Joy will never be the same.
Beth, I've got memories of pulling into the driveway of Mentmore Manor, which is an English country estate. On the sort of scale of the castle, it's more modern than castle, about as old as America is, but it's newer than castles. But I pulled into the driveway, and as I pulled into the driveway, my cassette recorder flipped over to Pomp and Circumstance. And it was just glorious timing. So yeah, I know that feeling.
Yeah.
Kathy, hi. I kept you for last here because I think you've actually been around Chris for longer than any of us.
Yeah, probably. At least longer ago than any of you.
And I know you've heard me tell your 5D story, and I know you've heard Chris tell your 5D story. Would you like to tell your 5D story yourself, or would you like me or Chris to tell it for you?
Well, to be honest with you, I think Chris has more memory of it than I do. He's got a better memory anyway, and it was 30 years ago. So, you know, like he can probably remember more of the detail than I, like, if you say it, then I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, I forgot about that.
Go on, Chris, fill in the details for Kathy then.
Okay, the quick version is Kathy came to do past life regression, and she was incredibly accurate. She would do things in the past, very deliberate, but very accurate. She'd do things in the past, so you'd have to be an anthropologist to have the kind of detail she had. And one time she suddenly says, in 1992, can I go into the future? And I said, sure, it's your trip, you can go wherever you want. And so she went into the year 2000, and this is 1992, and she's on the East Coast, and she finds herself on a scenic overlook in the year 2000, where she will later be when she moves to Oregon. And so that was, and that we didn't know at the time. But the next thing she does is she said, I'm going to go into the future. I think it's something like the 2060s. And I'm visiting my parents. I'm living, you know, I live in they think I live in Oregon. I don't live in Oregon. I live in Oregon on the higher earth. And these are the ugliest shoes I've ever seen. I can't believe I bought these shoes. And I said, could we skip the Taurian thing and get back to the upper and lower earth thing? And they're curled. Yeah, I got it. They're curled at the toe. What about the upper earth? Well, you have to go in from the upper earth to this lower earth. And in fact, they're alien races that help you make the shift so that I can visit my parents, but they don't know there's an upper earth. And it was one of the few times, and she gave more detail than that, but there was one of the few times that we started discussing among people who'd heard the two Earths prophecy, is it possible they're talking about two physical Earths? And that's been a hot topic since the 90s, the early 90s. But that was one of the most fun ones, and it got a whole conversation going with there were two people who did the book Mass Dreams of the Future, Helen Wambach and Chet Snow. And I once was asked to a dinner with Chet. I didn't know he was going to be there after Helen was gone. And he had the same experience, that they usually, when they had people projected into the future, they had a kind of timeline with some variations. All of a sudden, he was discovering two quite separate timelines. And he'd never heard of the two Earths prophecy. So I told him Kathy's story. And he said, well, that's interesting. So she was kind of a catalyst there for that.
Well, you know, I've been, these last few years, I've been doing a lot of research on my own. And Dolores Cannon always talked about two separate Earths, like two physical separate Earths. And that was the impression that, and then I've also been following these videos of people who do her QHHT, I think it's whatever Dolores Cannon's therapy, you know, where and a lot of them were talking about, like, they all seem to have the same story when that transformation happens, that there's a choice that they can make of where to go. And they make it sound in those like there's different physicalities too. Like in that I felt like when we did the progression that I was on Earth, but it wasn't this Earth, like it didn't look like this. It looked like this Earth without humans wrecking it, like human intervention of anything. You know, that's what it looked like to me. And I mean, that would be nice. And I assume that it's a different place than this. I don't know, but that's what I assume. I mean, I always feel like right now, I never really wondered what my purpose is supposed to be, because I feel like I always knew that my purpose happens once we go through this transformation. And I thought that too when I saw that, when we did that progression, because I had told you what my job was there. And Trevor, you asked me once before, like, what would be your ideal job? And I'm like, oh, I don't really have one. I don't know. I can't seem to find anything I really like doing here. And then I thought about that progression and what I was doing in the future. Then I thought, that is my ideal job. That is something exactly I would love to do that. I want to do that really bad. So I just hope it happens soon. Because I'm like,
Yeah, I was
so
going to say, Kathy,
done with this earth.
Kathy, if you're really good at pregressions, can we pregress you just to, I'd be happy with December 31st, 2023 at the moment.
I know, really. Yeah. I'm game. If anybody wants to help me do that, I'm game to do a progression again.
Do we know anybody who's a good hypnotherapist who's done that type of thing before, Chris?
I don't know, who is that? Oh yeah, this girl.
Well, no, not yeah. Beth is a good hypnotherapist herself, but of course, Chris was the person who took Kathy through the first time.
That's true. That's true.
But I think she's one of those people that's so good, anybody can do it. When you have a good retriever, you think, okay. And I remember once we were, she was someplace in ancient Greece, and okay, Kathy, where are we going? I don't really know yet. Why not? Because the kids are playing with the sheep. When are they going to be done? I don't know. They're playing with the sheep. When you get that kind of detail, you don't have to work very hard. Just keep asking the obvious questions. Right? So she's one of the good ones, yeah.
Cool. Guys, we're at the bottom of the hour. Any last questions for Chris?
Well, do you, Chris, have any intuition as to when this transformation will happen?
Well, I'm kind of curious about whether it will be a second separate Earth. And I lean a little bit toward it might be a separate physical thing. And that being the case, the building that might take, the awareness is likely to come before the actual physical thing. And the awareness will start to shape these communities. Then the communities will, in a sense, shape that higher Earth. I think the choices that people are making, the awareness is probably something that's a function of this year. The actual formation of those communities, if I were guessing, and I was talking to Jim Lee about it with his projections, the futurist Jim Lee, he and I are both looking at a building through 2026, then a kind of, okay, last sort of which way do we want to go? And then 2030, he sees a big change again. And so I think it's a few years as this community formation happens, because if you just think about one of the things happening around here is suddenly people are talking more to each other. They're engaging more in nature. There are farmers markets everywhere. I mean, I'm here in Mary's apartment, and here's this big apartment complex, and the people running it just hired this young couple who opened a farm. They're here every Friday selling vegetables inexpensively to the people who want it. Now that's happening all over this place. You think of that growing more and more and more, and think, okay, how long does it take for that transition to move from fun to pretty total? So I'm thinking people feel very different by the end of this year. But I think the actual formation may take a little bit longer, but no guess as to how long.
Well, so you don't get any sense that there is going to be a solar flash that'll physically strike Earth and transform everyone on the planet?
Well, that's a very difficult thing to say, because there's a certain extent to which the planets are all very intelligent and talk to each other, and they move around their suns, their light sources, which are alive, and so they're always feeding And like there's an old native teaching that, you know, spend as much time in the sun as you can, relative to all sorts of other considerations, because it's giving you information, you're downloading things. So yeah, Kathy, I would say if that's necessary, that could happen anytime and speed
Right.
things up. So I would allow for that. In fact, I'm taking a gradual approach with my fingers crossed. It'll actually be fast.
Good, me too.
And certainly this point of this build up, I've watched the individual awareness of us being empaths building up. For me, obviously, it's been in the last 11 years since I realized, oh, there's a word that applies to me. And in the process of everybody else waking up to the fact that, oh, this thing, empath, is real and it applies to me. So we've been waking up as individuals. We've been coming together in terms of communities. And I'm starting to see the teachers working together more and more. And so, like a snowball rolling down a huge, very snowy mountain, we're seeing this snowball just gathering speed and gathering momentum. And it doesn't take long for a snowball to double in size. And the further down the slope is, the larger doubling in size actually consists of.
Isn't that the golden proportion once again?
Yes, it is.
Yep. So guys, may you all live in interesting times. Oops, sorry, too late. Chris, thank you for joining us this evening.
Yes, thank you, Chris.
Thank you, everybody, for letting
Thank
me
you,
be
Chris.
here. It was great
Good
meeting
to
all
meet
of you.
Great to meet you.
We will have this available on recording just as soon as I download and make it available. But for now, I will see you all soon. Thank you very much. And
Thank
actually,
you.
for anybody who's interested in Chris's contact information, just reach out to me and I'll pass it on. We can get you on mailing lists. We can get you invites into his video sessions, his group video sessions. And it's about connecting, because there's going to be so much more connecting going on as we move further into 5D. So having
I don't want to hold anybody up, but I have a couple more questions, so I'll
go
just ask.
go on then, Marcy.
No, I know this is really all, I'm energized. I'm tingling. I love this because I get excited, but I've noticed this happening, and it's one of those things where I say, that's interesting. I didn't know until this morning that there was an actual aurora borealis last week, right? That people were seeing the northern lights in the sky in Minnesota and Texas. I thought that's why things were so off kilter last week. Seemed as if everybody I spoke to had some issues going on. And then another thing which I found interesting is that I have a ringing in my ear, so I have tinnitus, and it comes in. It's different. It's a different. It's different now. I had a humming, more like humming, and then the ringing and the humming went away on the right ear, and it's like the scale is a little higher. But I reached out to an audiologist, and the response I had from the scheduler was that they can't see me until September. And I'm like, well, why is that? Because they're seeing an awful lot of tinnitus and vertigo with patients. It's increased. So I'm like, that's fascinating to me. Like, what is happening is that people are trying to get the message, and it's just, it's all happening at one time. So I don't know, you're shaking your head. I'm just making an observation. And I spend time trying to get rid of this. And now I'm wondering, something's trying to come to me. There's a message coming somewhere. So yeah.
I have tonight, I call it tinnitus.
Yeah,
whatever.
tinnitus.
Mine came on strong in the middle of 2021. And it's constant. It would be it first started mostly in my left ear, and every now and then I would have it both. Now it's consistently both.
Yeah. And the frequency has increased in my right ear. And it's interesting. So I'm just observing it. I'm okay with it. I know there's something coming out of it. There's a message coming, but I just thought it was fascinating that these doctors are saying huge increase of vertigo and tinnitus. So they can't, you can't see anybody till September. It's interesting. So
Yeah, we have the same thing around here. I've had tinnitus for a variety of reasons for 3 or 4 decades. Part of it's related to childhood trauma. Part of it's related, there are certain imbalances that can make it worse, but also from Arthur Firstenberg's book, The Invisible Rainbow, every time the electromagnetic fields jump up, sensitives can hear electricity and it registers as tinnitus. So there are lots of things going on that are tinnitus. And I think, and the vertigo is another one that's practically everybody was talking about vertigo in January and February. And I think they might still have, they just don't talk about it anymore. Getting used to it.
that was it.
So tell you what, let me finish with some affirmations because I just did a quick scan of my book for tinnitus. And so let me share. I'm releasing all that is unlike the action of love. That sounds like Louise, directly from Louise Hay. I'm releasing all that is unlike the action of love. I'm trusting my higher self. I'm listening with love to my inner voice. I'm listening to the information from my environment. I'm embracing my inner knowing and my inner voice. So that's probably a good way to finish this session tonight on 5D. Blessings to you all. Go out and enjoy. Look after yourselves, and if you can, look after somebody else too.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Chris.
Guys,
Thanks, Trevor.
Chris.
Bye.
Thanks, Chris.